Hello, and welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Today, we're going to the Lewis-Clark Valley, Lewiston, Idaho, Clarkston, and Asotin, Washington, a place defined by rivers and small-town bonds, and by a cluster of disappearances and murders between 1979 and 1982 that left a community with more questions than answers. This story is quietly devastating. It's about 5 people, missing, murdered, presumed dead, and the long shadow those losses have cast across 4 decades. Caleb, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Mara. It's good to be here. The Lewis-Clark Valley cases are the kind that stay with you, not just because of the crimes, but because of how they reveal the limits of policing, the way communities process violence, and how evidence, physical and human, ages. I'm glad we can walk through this carefully.
So let's start with place and time, just to ground listeners. The valley sits where the Snake River meets the Clearwater. Lewiston on the Idaho side, Clarkston and Asotin across the river in Washington. Late 1970s, early 1980s, a blue-collar, conservative place. Paper mills, colleges, theaters, fishing, hunting, people who mostly knew each other. That matters because the cases we'll talk about unfolded in that small-town ecosystem.
Right. And you feel that closeness in every detail. Shared civic organizations, the Lewiston Civic Theater as a local hub, college students from Lewis-Clark State College. In a town like that, rumors travel fast. So do grief and suspicion. But it also means crimes can be hidden in plain sight when the perpetrator is someone inside that network. It complicates investigations.
It really does. Okay, chronological approach. We begin in spring 1979 with a 12-year-old girl named Christina Lee White. She vanished on April 28, 1979, in Asotin. It was Asotin County Fair Day, basically a town event. Witnesses placed her at the fairgrounds, at a friend's house, that kind of day. The last confirmed contact was a phone call to her mother, Betty White, around 2 to 2:30 in the afternoon. Christina said she felt overheated and ill.
And there are, over the years, a few different recollections about what Betty told Christina on that call. One account is that Betty told her to lie down and meet her downtown when she felt better. Another is that Betty told her to walk home and watch for her. Minor variations, but they matter because the last confirmed movements are fuzzy. That uncertainty complicates any reconstruction of an abduction timeline.
Yes, and her white 10-speed bicycle was never recovered. Weeks later, torn pieces of her schoolwork were found in a field outside Asotin, as if someone had handled or tried to shred personal items. At the time, her disappearance was treated as an isolated missing child case. No body, no clear crime scene, no arrest. Decades later, investigators would start to see links between Christina's disappearance and other cases, a thread that wasn't obvious in 1979.
It's worth pausing on the geography there. Asotin is close to the river and rural roads leading out toward Lewiston. For someone trying to obscure evidence, river canyons and remote fields create opportunities for concealment. In small towns, that terrain can be an ally to someone who wants to hide a crime. It's one reason investigators later wondered if Christina was connected to later victims.
Exactly. And one detail that stood out later, the friend's house where Christina called from was, by later reporting, associated with the girlfriend and later wife of a man who would become central to the theater-linked investigation. That geographic coincidence raised eyebrows and, over time, folded Christina into a larger suspected pattern.
We should emphasize that association is circumstantial. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but by itself, it's not proof. Still, when you add that to other common elements, proximity to the Civic Theater, recurring roads and disposal sites, the pattern gains weight. But weight is not a courtroom.
Right. Weight, but not proof. Let's move to June 26th, 1981. Kristin David, age 22, a University of Idaho senior in Moscow. She was bicycling down U.S. Highway 95 toward Lewiston on a blue 10-speed. Witnesses later reported seeing a man in a brown vehicle approaching a woman matching her description near Genesee. Other women on that road that day said the same vehicle had tried to pull up to female cyclists or pedestrians, and they found it predatory.
Then the discovery, early July. Dismembered remains found near Silcott Island along the Snake River, wrapped in black plastic garbage bags and pages of local newspapers from April 1981. Some bones were never recovered, clothing and the bicycle never found. The brutality and the care with which the remains were bagged and wrapped suggest a level of organization and an intent to conceal. It's one of the most gruesome parts of this cluster.
Genuinely horrific. Investigators in 1984 briefly considered Otis Toole a suspect. He reportedly implicated himself, but that line didn't hold. 2 other men also confessed at one point, and a retired Lewiston detective who interviewed Toole later publicly ruled him out. So Toole becomes a red herring in the record, a name that distracted, but investigators who worked the case dismissed him after interviewing him. That happens more often than people might think.
Yes. High-profile serial offenders sometimes falsely implicate themselves in other murders, either for attention or because of mental illness. That makes the job of local investigators harder. They have to separate credible leads from noise. In Kristin David's case, police gradually concluded her murder was linked to other Valley cases rather than the act of a national transient killer. The newspapers used to wrap her remains, April editions, are also an odd, telling detail. It says something about the storage or access to such papers. It's a small lead that can imply a location where the perpetrator spent time.
The newspaper detail always struck me. Use of recent local newspapers, April 1981, not the day's paper, but only months old. It could indicate a garage, a shop, a place where that kind of paper was kept. Or it could be random. Hard to know.
And again, not conclusive, but it layers into a pattern. Mara, can I ask, when you worked on stories like this, how do you keep the emotional tone somber without it becoming sensational?
Good question, Caleb. For me, it's about centering the people, their names, their families, the daily life they had before the crime. Also being precise with language, saying alleged or suspected when it comes to uncharged individuals, not embellishing details that aren't in the record. Letting silence play a role, allowing the weight of missing answers to be heard. Okay, moving on.
That restraint matters. Listeners want clarity, but they also deserve fairness. The facts should carry the haunting. Hyperbole doesn't honor the victims.
All right. September 12, 1982. The night that ties everything most tightly to the Lewiston Civic Theater. 3 people disappear that evening. Kristina Diane Nelson, 21, Jacqueline Ann Brandy Miller, 18, and Stephen R. Pearsall, 35. Christina and Brandy were stepsisters. Christina had worked at the Civic Theater. Brandy lived with her. They walked out to buy snacks and didn't come back. Stephen, he worked at the theater. He played clarinet. He was dropped off to do laundry and practice. All 3 vanish.
At first, there was suspicion. because Stephen was an adult male connected to the two younger women, that he might have harmed them. But the evidence undercuts the idea of voluntary disappearance. His clarinet remained at the theater. An uncashed paycheck sat at his apartment. His car was left parked. Those are not the signs of someone planning to start a new life. Over time, investigators shifted to the view that all three were victims, possibly killed because Stephen saw something and was silenced. It's a heartbreaking pivot.
And on March 19, 1984, the remains of Kristina Nelson and Brandy Miller were found about 35 miles from Lewiston, near Kendrick, Idaho. Brandy's death was determined to be homicide. For Christina, the cause of death could not be conclusively established. Stephen Pearsall, though, still missing, presumed dead, but no body recovered. So you have two bodies discovered, one not, and a sense that whatever happened that night might have occurred inside or near the Civic Theater. That building, it becomes almost a character in the story.
Yes, the Civic Theater is central, a community space with basements, storage rooms, places where someone with keys and knowledge could move with ease. Investigators in the mid-1990s publicly said they believed the Nelson-Miller-Pearsall case occurred in the theater, and that it likely involved another theater employee, described as a man in his 30s or 40s at the time. Independent media later identified him as Lance Voss, but we must be clear, he was never charged. That distinction matters ethically and legally.
Absolutely. The record shows that the man worked there the night the three vanished and had ties that overlap with other victims. He was interviewed multiple times by law enforcement, had access, and lived locally. Those are the kinds of links that make investigators and families point in one direction. But the law requires more than suspicion. Caleb?
Naming an uncharged suspect is fraught. Documentaries like Confluence and TV shows like Cold Valley have publicly identified him. Confluence in 2011 walked through those geographic and relational links and named the then unnamed suspect. Cold Valley, an investigation discovery two-part series in 2018, reiterated the theory and tied the suspect to multiple cases. Media attention can spur tips, but it also creates the risk of trial by media and witness contamination. We need to weigh benefits and harms.
Which brings up the question listeners always ask, why no charges? The short answer is the evidence is circumstantial in many places. Key scenes were never preserved as crime scenes. Some victims have no bodies. Some remains are degraded. And prosecutors face the risk of acquittal if they go to trial without strong physical evidence. There were false confessions, Toole and others, which added confusion early on. Over time, what survives is pattern and proximity, not the smoking gun.
Exactly. And consider the constraints of small-town policing in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Limited forensic capabilities, paper records, no practical DNA profiling. Some evidence that would change everything today wasn't collected or preserved then. That's not blame. It's context for why certain lines of inquiry died or became less productive.
Let's talk about investigative evolution. In the 1990s and 2000s, different agencies re-examined leads. The FBI maintained a file on Kristin David, and there was cross-jurisdiction collaboration, a Soton County Sheriff's Office handling Christina's case, Lewiston Police for the theater disappearances, Latah County for Highway 95 where Kristin was traveling, and later contact with Spokane and others when investigators looked at possible ties to other offenders. Modern tools, DNA, genetic genealogy, digital reconstruction, could, in theory, open doors that were closed.
Right. Theoretically. If usable DNA exists from preserved materials, hair, tissue, fibers on newspaper or bags, genetic genealogy could be an option. But the public record doesn't indicate any successful genetic genealogy hits in these cases, and the reality is many items were never collected or have degraded. Even so, media attention, documentaries, and podcasts can prompt people to come forward with memories or tips that were never shared before. That's been the real practical effect in many cold cases.
And there's a delicate balance. Re-examination can generate new leads, but it can also lead to public naming and speculation about people who were never charged. Ethically, journalists and podcasters need to be careful. But for families, and here I want to be very clear, many of them believe they know who did it. They've lived with that certainty, mixed with the impotence of no arrest. Kristin David's cousins and siblings have spoken publicly. Betty White, Christina's mother, has spoken about that last phone call. They live in a state of ongoing grief and frustration.
Here. The human toll is enormous. For families, a legal conviction would end the uncertainty. For some, naming and community acknowledgement is part of justice, even if there's no courtroom victory. For others, the absence of a trial means formal accountability never arrives. Mara, you mentioned community memory. How do local papers and oral memory keep cases like these alive?
Local papers, like the Lewiston Morning Tribune, ran regular coverage, anniversaries, and retrospectives that kept details in the public eye. Over years, memories change, details get blurred, but the coverage preserves a timeline. Meanwhile, rumor and gossip do distort things too. So you get a mix, useful archival material in the papers, plus the human error of recollection. That's why modern investigators try to triangulate archived reporting, witness statements, and physical records when they reopen cases.
And those three elements, physical evidence, archival records, and human recollection, each age differently. Physical evidence can degrade. Archives persist, but can be incomplete or biased. Memories can be unreliable, yet still point to useful leads. Cold case units have to balance that.
Let's address some common questions and misconceptions. First, are all 5 cases, Christina White, Kristin David, Kristina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Stephen Pearsall, truly connected? Many investigators say yes. Temporal clustering, geographic concentration, and shared institutions like the Civic Theater make a compelling case. But there are arguments for caution. Victim profiles vary. Ages range from 12 to 35. MO differs. Dismemberment in David's case versus intact remains for Nelson and Miller. So while the dominant working theory is a single local offender, not every expert agrees.
And that's an important nuance. Serial offending does not always present with a single, unchanging signature. Offenders can evolve. They can have opportunistic crimes mixed with ritualized acts. But skeptics point rightly to differences in victimology and MO. The prudent conclusion is there is a cluster that looks pattern-like, but pattern does not equal proof of a single perpetrator. We need to keep that distinction in mind.
The Otis Toole piece we mentioned, that's an example of how high-profile names can derail local investigations. Toole implicated himself in Kristin's murder, but investigators who interviewed him dismissed the confession. He'd falsely confessed to many crimes, which complicates parsing credible admissions. That's a cautionary tale about the allure of clear answers.
Another misconception was early speculation that Stephen might have been the perpetrator. Over time, evidence undercut that. His personal effects left behind indicate he didn't plan to flee. Police eventually treated him as a victim. That evolution matters because public speculation can unfairly tarnish someone's memory and hurt families. Again, the human cost is profound.
Let's spend a little time on the suspect who drew prolonged scrutiny, the theater employee. Investigators in January 1995 publicly suggested the trio case occurred inside the Civic Theater and was committed by another theater worker, a man later identified in some media as Lance Voss. Reporting ties him circumstantially to multiple victims. He worked at the theater the night of the disappearance. His then-girlfriend's house links geographically to Christina's last known phone call. He was interviewed by law enforcement and by Spokane detectives when they evaluated possible links to other serial offenders, but again, never charged. The ethics here keep turning over in my head.
They should. Naming someone in public media puts pressure on investigators and can spur tips, but it also can ruin reputations if the evidence isn't there for prosecution. In civil terms, it's dangerous territory. Militarizing suspicion on someone who never faced trial is an ethical line journalists must weigh. Mara, how do you think documentaries like Confluence and shows like Cold Valley change things?
They did two main things. One, they reopened public attention and generated tips from people who remembered things differently or were suddenly willing to speak. Two, they consolidated a narrative. The Civic Theater as the nexus, one likely local offender, and the painful idea that families still wait. But they also named suspects and laid out theories that prosecutors may not feel are legally sustainable. So there's a trade-off, new leads versus potential harm to due process. It's a messy, morally complicated space.
And of course, media attention sometimes prompts law enforcement to retest evidence with modern methods. There's no public record here of a breakthrough DNA or genealogy identification, but that doesn't mean nothing's been tested. It means results aren't publicly known. The FBI has kept files open on Kristin David. That suggests ongoing interest. That's hopeful, in a way.
Hopeful, but tempered. Families want answers, closure, accountability. For some, naming the likely offender is meaningful, even if it never leads to trial. For others, only a conviction will suffice. I want to talk now about what justice could look like if the case were ever solved. Caleb?
If investigators could get a DNA match to a suspect via preserved evidence or via discarded items, a prosecution could be possible if the evidence supports a charging decision. For victims without bodies, like Christina and Stephen, that's harder, but not impossible. There have been prosecutions built around circumstantial and forensic proofs. Alternatively, if the suspect were deceased, families might get a kind of institutional acknowledgement from the county or police, an admission of probable responsibility. But that's different than legal accountability. Justice has different meanings: legal, restorative, and symbolic.
Familial narratives will often say, "I just want the truth known." That's restorative in itself, but it's not a trial. Let's be practical for listeners who might be inspired to help. Law enforcement still accepts tips. A Asotin County Sheriff's Office, Lewiston Police Department, and media projects have prompted people to come forward with small, seemingly unimportant memories that later proved useful. So if you have information, contact local authorities. Do not take matters into your own hands. It matters we say that out loud.
Yes, tips help. Even small details, a name, a vehicle description, a comment about someone's habits in 1982, can light a path an investigator can follow. But the process is slow. Cold case work is iterative. People get frustrated by the pace, and I get that.
Me too. Before we wrap, I want us to step back and reflect. This is about more than pattern recognition and forensic opportunity. It's about how communities are forced to reckon with violence inside their own borders. The Civic Theater, a place of art and gathering, becomes, in some telling, a sight of horror. People who volunteered, who worked there for years, had to carry that tension. How does a community heal when the place that brought them together is also where trauma may have occurred?
Healing is complicated. Some communities preserve those places and commemorate victims publicly. Others shutter them. The important thing is not to erase memory, but to integrate it with care. Tell the truth, support victims' families, and ensure policing and archives are structured to prevent future evidence loss, and to teach future investigators the lessons of these cases.
I want to emphasize that the 5 people at the center of this episode, Christina, Kristin David, Kristina Nelson, Brandy Miller, and Stephen Pearsall, were full lives, loved by others, and not only defined by violence. When we talk about the tactical elements, the newspapers, the bike, the Civic Theater keys, we must always come back to their humanity. Caleb, any final thoughts on possibilities for resolution?
I'd say, don't give up on the possibility of new information. DNA technology and genetic genealogy have solved cases once thought impossible. Media attention continues to surface tips, but resolution will depend on preserved evidence, the willingness of witnesses to come forward, and prosecutorial thresholds. Families deserve honesty about that process. And the public can help by responsibly sharing information and contacting authorities, not rumor.
That's a fair note. We'll include resources and contact suggestions in our show notes. Assatan County Sheriff and Lewiston Police, if you have information, tell them. Please also be mindful. Some names floating online are uncharged individuals. We aim to be careful in our language. We'll link to the Confluence documentary, Cold Valley, and archival reporting for listeners who want to read more. Caleb, thanks for sitting with this with me.
Thank you, Mara. It's hard work, but necessary. These stories demand careful attention and respect for victims and families.
And to our listeners, thank you for listening. If this episode upset you, that's an understandable reaction. These are heavy stories. Reach out if you need support, and consider how you can help in a constructive way, by supporting cold case units or by checking our show notes for official contact points. We'll be back next week with another episode of Still Unanswered. Until then, hold close the people you love.
Take care.